Hi. How's everybody doing tonight? All right. I call that moderately positive. But it means we have somewhere to go. We can get better from here, right? Yeah, that's right. I heard some enthusiasm back there. Thank you all for being here. Thank you everyone who's watching online for being with us virtually. My name is Aidan Flax-Clark. I work here at the library putting together this series, so I am truly delighted that you're all with us. And we are, of course, extremely fortunate to be joined tonight by Ruha Benjamin and Rujeko Hockley. They are here to talk about Ruha's new book, Imagination, a Manifesto. Hopefully you all saw it outside, yeah? It's a beautiful, beautiful little book. I love tiny books like that. They're super deceptive. You think it's going to be, oh, this is super simple. I can breeze through this. And then it's just jam-packed with brilliance and insight. It feels like, 800 pages packed into 100 pages. Which is a testament to Ruha's brilliance, of course, and also the series that the book is a part of, which is called Norton Shorts, which I think last fall, and we're thrilled to be hosting an event for one of their books. It's a very cool series. I think there was a book by Taya Miles in there about women in the outdoors, and one that was called Literary Theory for Robots, which sounds either very cute or super terrifying. If you didn't pick up the book on the way in, it will be available for sale afterward as well. And proceeds from your purchase will go to benefit the New York Public Library. And I believe that Ruha will also be signing the book afterward. And generally, for those of you who would like to get your book signed, we ask folks to line up here on the left, but I didn't verify that with my colleagues, so I would ask at the book table afterward to make sure. And of course, you can get all of her books with your library card, which obviously everyone in this room certainly has, right? You wouldn't come into the library and not have a library card, right? Because that would be really embarrassing. We are thrilled to also have Rujeko Hockley with us to speak with Ruha. Rujeko is the Arnhold Associate Curator at the Whitney Museum, where among many other things, she co-curated the Whitney Biennial in 2019. Her full bio, as well as Ruha's, is in your program. If you're watching online, it's on the event listing. At the end of the conversation, if you have some questions, hopefully you got a note card when you came in, write them down. Some of my colleagues will come by and pick them up, and they will get to as many as they can. If you're watching online, you can put your question in the chat, or you can email publicprograms@nypl.org. We like to get your questions wherever you are, so please send them in. We're going to start with a short talk from Ruha, so please join me in welcoming Rujeko Hockley and Ruha Benjamin.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for making time to come out and be in conversation with us. Everyone here at the library, behind the scenes, my team, my publishing team at Norton that happens to be across the street, Amy and colleagues, thank you so much. My literary agent, Sarah, who's here, who I'm meeting for the first time in person because we had a virtual relationship for 5 years, and so she's here. And of course, the incredible Rujeko Hockley. So let's get started. About 15 years ago, when I took my first job as a professor, trying to learn everything I could about teaching because somehow they don't teach you that in grad school, I came across a famous study conducted by NASA that was focused on creativity. The researchers were interested in measuring the capacity for what they called divergent thinking. That is, the ability to see beyond what's right in front of us and come up with many different ways of looking at a problem, thinking of solutions. So what they did was they followed 1,600 children over many years, giving them a creativity test that was initially designed for NASA recruits. And the results were shocking in that 98% of 5-year-olds fell into the genius category for divergent thinking. More shocking still was that each year, the percentage dropped until only 12% of 15-year-olds and 2% of adults exhibited this creative capacity. In other words, our inherent genius is schooled out of us. The very place we should be able to go to incite our imagination is the place where it's routinely squashed, ground down, standardized. not inevitably, but predictably. And it's not just individual students who suffer, but society as a whole. So what if we took imagination seriously? Not as a flight of fancy or something reserved only for self-proclaimed artists, but imagination as a resource, a muscle, a capacity. How might the power of our collective imagination begin to transform the world around us? So to explore these questions, let's try a little exercise. We'll break the room in two. So people who think you're in the middle, like in the middle, put your hand up. If you think you're in the middle, okay. So put your hands down, okay. Yeah, you keep in the middle, right? Okay, so everyone on this side of that middle row, your catchphrase is be bold. When I point to you, I want you to say it like you're trying to shoot me up into the air, all right? Everyone on the other side of that middle row, your catchphrase is get real, all right? And I want you to say it like you're trying to flatten me into the ground, okay? So let's just practice, ready? All right.
Be bold, get real.
Perfect. Right. So when I point to you, space travel.
Be bold.
Free public transportation. Colonize Mars. Decolonize Earth. AI superintelligence. Cancel student debt. Build underground bunkers to survive the AI apocalypse. Build affordable housing for all. Spend billions on weapons and war. Stop the genocide. Cease fire now. You get the picture. Boldness is rationed, while realism is mass-produced. We are in many ways trapped inside the lopsided imagination of those who monopolize power and resources to benefit the few at the expense of the many. These futurists let their own imaginations run wild when it comes to bending our material and digital realities. But their visions grow limp when it comes to transforming our social reality so that everyone has the chance to live a good and meaningful life. So with that in mind, I thought I'd share 3 experiences that have really shaped my own thinking on this relationship between innovation, inequity, and imagination. Before I do, I should say that I come from many Souths. By that I mean I was born in southern India, raised equal parts in South Central LA and South Carolina. I spent formative years in the South Pacific and Southern Africa, and went to college in Southwest Atlanta. So I come from many Souths, which means that I bring this perspective of looking at the world from its underbelly to all of my work. So let's start with experience number 1. I'm 15 years old. My family packs up house in South Carolina and moves to the Marshall Islands for my parents' work. We land on the capital island of Majuro. Soon after settling in, I make friends, and they want to show me around to some of the outer islands. So the first place we go is a pair of islands called Kwajalein and Ibai. Kwajalein is a US military base. And when you go there, you have no idea that you're in the Pacific. It feels like you're in the middle of Stepford Wives or The Truman Show. Baskin Robbins, golf courses, people walking around with strollers, very little, evidence or sign of the Pacific. Short ferry ride away, Ibai, where people who were displaced and moved off of Kwajalein now live. It's concentrated. Very little vegetation. Most of the homes are sort of makeshift tin roofs. TB rate is 26 times that of the United States. And Marshallese who want to go to Kwajalein have to have a special pass, usually to work. And so at 15 years old, one of my first observations is this juxtaposition. And it made me realize that seeming utopias need dystopias, that these aren't parallel realities, but one necessitates the other. Fast forward, I'm in my 20s, I'm in grad school at Berkeley, and I'm looking around for a dissertation topic. I have 2 little ones running around, so I can't do something fancy like go overseas. And I'm studying the sociology of science and technology. And the state is investing money into this, at that time, new field of stem cell research. And the federal government had cut off funds, so the state proponents in the state created a ballot measure for voters to decide whether we wanted to invest. So on the ballot, Prop 71 would allocate $3 billion to this new field, create a new state stem cell agency, a new constitutional amendment, a right to research amendment. And on the very same ballot is Prop 72, which would have extended healthcare to the vast majority of Californian workers. And on that particular election, the future of medicine was voted up, but healthcare for all was voted down. So again, we can imagine the future, but what we could do yesterday, there was not that will to invest. I remember one of the headlines, one of the journalists writing about this said, imagine cardiac cells beating in a petri dish. Because the idea with regenerative medicine is if you need an organ donation, you don't need a donor. We can take your own cells and reverse engineer and grow an organ just for you, right? So imagine cardiac cells beating in a petri dish. But we can't imagine growing empathy for other human beings in our everyday lives. So again, this juxtaposition in my 20s. Last stop on the tour, a few months ago. I'm back in Atlanta, which is where I went to college. And I was hearing these new kind of like nicknames for the city, one of which is Techlanta, the other one is Silicon Peach. Again, to note that this is one of the fastest growing tech hubs in the nation. Also, the city with the highest income inequality in the country. Not unrelated. Because where there have been tech booms, people who've lived there for generations have been displaced and discarded by higher rents and or evictions. And with growing inequality, you have to manage that. Hence, a new investment of $90 million in what is called Cop City, a training facility that would bring law enforcement from all over the country. And to create Cop City, which is, again, a facility for them to practice and train and militarize, essentially, they have to cut down Weelaunee Forest, which is one of the 4 lungs of Atlanta. And so, again, thinking about the imaginations that are getting materialized. A friend of mine was at one of the city council meetings where opponents of Cop City were gathered to testify. They had created a little kid zone for the kids to play while the parents were inside. And she took a photo of one of the drawings that the child had created, a 10-year-old. And it said, what did cops do to deserve a playground? Because their own school was shuttered in the shadow of Cop City. So you see, this is divergent thinking at its best, right? Already pushing back against the militarizing imagination of, the city, but also corporations that are helping to fund it. In the process, though, we've witnessed an historic mobilization of residents from all walks of life. ATLians pushing back against this militarizing imagination, from college students to clergy, environmental activists to indigenous leaders. These forest defenders are inviting us into an alternate imagination of the future where our social and our ecological well-being are interconnected, where true safety comes from connection, not more cops, but not without a price. Back in November, 61 Cop City protesters were arraigned on bogus racketeering and domestic terrorism charges, most facing 5 to 20 years in prison for protesting, to silence the movement, setting a vile and dangerous precedent. Last month, the Georgia Senate passed a bill criminalizing state bail funds for protest groups and making it illegal for charitable organizations to bail out more than 3 people a year. Just yesterday, the state of Georgia passed a law allowing police to arrest anyone they suspect of being undocumented immigrants, reminding us it's not that more police are needed to deal with crime. Rather, more and more people are criminalized to justify police. So the struggle continues. Like Atlanta's forest defenders, we have to be bold in our social vision. But how? The first step is to stop policing the borders of our own imaginations. A world without prisons? Ridiculous. Schools that foster the genius of every child? Naive. Work that doesn't grind us into the grave? Impossible. A society where everyone has food, shelter, love in your dreams. Exactly. With that, please join me in conversation. Thank you.
I feel kind of bad that I want you to keep talking.
No.
I mean, they probably do too.
No.
But this will be good too. But you are incredible. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being here and inviting me to be with you. Thank you all for coming. This is an amazing book. You should read it, definitely. I've now read it twice. Wow. It's the first book I read in 2024. I have 2 small children, so I don't finish
That's
books.
saying a lot.
I don't finish books a lot, but I've read it twice, so I'm going to count it as 2.
Thank you.
And one of the things that I really loved about it was that this idea of creativity is what humans do. Mm-hmm. This is something I think about a lot in my work as a curator and why museums, why art is meaningful, but you kind of encapsulated it so beautifully. Something that's in the kind of the end of the book, you talk about making shit up university, that somebody came to visit your lab?
Yeah.
I don't know what to call it, your lab at Princeton, and encouraged you and your students to think about this idea of what is an unexpected title you would give yourself. And so, Ruha, you are a Princeton professor.
Yes.
But I am curious, what is the unexpected title that you would give yourself?
I love it. Okay, so first of all, the exercise that she's referring to is in the last chapter. The last chapter is called Imagination Incubator. So it has like activities, prompts, questions that you can do on your own, but really it's for like group settings, classes, organizations. And one of the early exercises is an icebreaker that I learned from Michelle King, a phenomenal educator who came to my lab. And she put on the screen, it was over Zoom, so she put on the screen this, what looked like a diploma from a college. And the college was listed as MSU University. And so there's a photo of the diploma in the book. And MSU stands for Making Shit Up. So in the icebreaker, you essentially introduce yourself beyond the kind of resume, CV stuff that we do, which is so boring and dry and reproduces hierarchies. You kind of get to share, express your quirks, your interests, passions. Okay. So I have a BA in avoiding phone calls like the plague. I have a master's degree in getting really silly after midnight. And I have a PhD in trying to practice what I preach.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I think that even reading it, I was like, oh, wow, that is like, ooh, how do we describe ourselves? And this idea of thinking of ourselves as me, as I, as us, not as my title, my accolades, my achievements, my identities outside of myself, like as a soul, I think is what's so critical to this book and to kind of perhaps what's needed in the world in a larger sense. So I'm curious, like, what motivated you to write this book, and why is it a manifesto?
Yes. So, I was thinking about this, where the book started. Usually we start writing before you start writing, like writing in your head, thinking about ideas. And I think I became really fixated on imagination after writing a book called Race After Technology. abolitionist tools for the new Jim Code. And when I was going and speaking to different groups and audiences and trying to distill like what I wanted them to take away, like what are 3 points, that are provocations that I really want you to take away from that book. One of them was that imagination is a battlefield. And I didn't write about imagination in that book, but after it was done and digested, I was thinking, okay, what am I trying to say? And this imagination kept coming up for me. And so I was talking a lot about it. And I started another project, and it happened in a kind of exchange with the good folks at Norton, who were starting this amazing series called Norton Shorts, which are all books that are under 200 pages, and somewhat geared to educators and students, but beyond that too, I think are really incredible topics relevant to wider audiences. And so in that exchange, they were like, what are you thinking about? What are you thinking about? What are you going to write about? And so it's like that prodding and that exchange that made me think, I've been thinking a lot about imagination. And again, I wasn't writing about it. My next book was Viral Justice. And so this was really an opportunity and grew out of this sort of synergy with the folks at Norton for me to give me a chance to kind of take all the things I'd been thinking about imagination. And I guess the last thing I'll just say in this origin sort of story is to say that I really wanted not to romanticize imagination. Mm-hmm. So a good part of the book is really trying to name and identify harmful visions. Mm-hmm. And specifically harmful visions that are packaged as new and are sort of presented to us as progress. And so again, thinking back to the technology bit, you can see how that works in. And so I try to name that and give that some expression, but then at the same time inviting us not to submit to that, but to think about how we can push back and are pushing back really in many different ways. And so, yeah, it was kind of born in that process and that exchange with a number of people.
Yeah. Are they all manifestos though? Or just
manifesto,
manifesto?
But yeah, so I feel like, why a manifesto? Because I just want to set the sort of expectation that I'm not going to hide behind this idea of academic neutrality. Like, I care about this. I think, have a perspective, and I think it's right. and I want you to like what? So I'm not trying to, present the facts. Like, I learned very early in my other projects that the facts alone will not save us.
Well, I think even this idea of academic neutrality is, and any neutrality actually is a fallacy.
Exactly.
And I think goes to this exercise that we did, the Be Bold, Get Real. It's extremely lopsided.
Yes,
and the things where we are living in an imagination, which is all the things that are Be Bold and none of the things that are Get Real. I think that it really made me think about this. The exercise made me think, but also reading the book about something you say, quieting the cynical voice inside is the first step to kind of bringing imagination kind of re-inspiring, reigniting this kind of faculty that we all have inherently. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the kind of pernicious influence of cynicism, which is something that comes up, pessimism, cynicism, kind of even I would say sarcasm sometimes. And how do you quiet the cynical voice inside? Or how have you, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that there's so much to reason to be cynical. Like, I don't feel like that's there's so much to make us feel disillusioned and cynical and pessimistic. I mean, so it's not at all trying to have, what do they call it, toxic positivity. That's not the point. But it's, I'm realizing again, I'm fighting my training, which is, again, steeped in the diagnosis of what's ailing us. Like, coming out of the social sciences, we are very adept at naming all of the harms, all of the things we want to get rid of that are killing us. And I realized, through an exchange with a mentor some years ago, that one of the things he said, I was pitching different titles for a project. He said, we give so much space, Ruha, we give so much intellectual space for naming the world we don't want. And we don't carve out much space for naming what we do want. There's a reason for that. I mean, one, it's seen as naive. It's not as sophisticated as being able to point out all the bad things. But in that exchange, it really motivated me to, no matter what I'm doing, if I'm teaching a class, if I'm giving a talk, if I'm working with an organization, if I'm writing a book, to try to force myself to develop a vocabulary that's not just naming harms, but trying to point to possible futures, and also point to things that many people are doing right under our noses, to shine a light on that so we can grow it, right? And so I think in the same way that we think about like our media diet, like what you're consuming, I think we have to think about that even more broadly beyond media, what we're reading, what the conversations we're having, and to catch ourselves when we're only looking at, there's a reason why. If you want to stay alive, you need to see what's coming after you, you know what I mean? But I think we also have to be able, at the same time, uproot and seed. Uproot and seed. Because if we uproot everything and we haven't seeded anything, we're just going to be standing in an empty field. So we need to be doing both. Maybe not the same equal all the time, but just carving out space and just paying attention to how that is. So whatever context for me in academia, it's like thinking about just our naming practices and what we shine a light on, what we call attention to, and trying to find ways. And I guess the last thing I'll say on this is, thinking about this tradition. Again, much of the book is really bringing to light all the ways that people have been theorizing and creating and generating imagination for good too, right? There's so many people I'm in conversation with. And the role of pessimism, I think of Baldwin's words, I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. To be a pessimist means you've decided that human life is an academic matter. I must survive what I must survive. And so again, another mentor, Ruthie Gilmore, was just on a call, Zoom thing with her, and the way she put it was, she said, pessimism is counter-revolutionary. That's the way she put it. And so again, thinking about who it serves for us to be pessimistic, right? And who needs us to continue to fight and generate energy for the way forward.
I love that. I think this thing of attention also came up for me a lot in the book, and comes up for me a lot in general. We all have our phones. Yes. We all have a very steady stream of essentially distraction, and often kind of negative distraction and negative attention, kind of what you're talking about. And I'm curious, something that I don't remember what section of the book it was in, but you talked about or quoted somebody who was talking about what a way to kind of, again, help to awaken this innate faculty is to pay attention, and to kind of observe and to kind of keep a journal and basically do things that don't involve a device beyond your brain and your hand and maybe a piece of paper. And I'm curious, as a person who has theorized around technology, around the ways in which technology intersects with race and our lived experience, how I'm like Ruha, tell me all the answers. How do you do that? How do you approach that? Yeah, well, and also because we have our jobs. Our phone it's work, it's friends, it's music, it's books, it's everything. Actual phone. It's everything in one, and so it is the ultimate distract. And then there's the actual official distractors. Haven't even got to Instagram. So how do we? I'm just curious about how you, as a person who professionally thinks about that, but also as a human being, like how do you cultivate attention in your own life?
I think, first of all, I do not put myself as any role model for this. So So when you see me on my phone, don't. But in some ways, the same principle applies to any area of our life that we want to cultivate good habits. Is I don't think it's a matter of willpower. It's not a matter of just like I'm deciding and then I'm going to do it. Like we have to put ourselves in environments that reflect back at us what we want to do and be. Right? So environments being whether it's putting your phone in another room or whether it's surrounding yourselves with friends who make you forget about your phone. And so all of the ways that we, try to put ourselves in context where whatever habit we're trying to develop can be reinforced, right? So I think in general, that's a kind of rule that I apply in many different, I don't just rely on myself. I don't believe in that, like, just do it. And so if it has to do with media, but then specifically with technology, I think we have to again, in rejecting the kind of individualist pull yourself up model, we have to put the responsibility on those who are making these platforms and apps so addictive. A colleague of mine, I think she's still at MIT, she wrote a great book called Addiction by Design.
Yeah.
But she was focused on gambling in Las Vegas. She did a long-term ethnography in Las Vegas. And then what she found, like towards the end of the book, she was like, oh, the same people and companies who are making the gambling machines, they're the very same people who are making the video games. And so the same affordances, the same, reinforcements that are pinging at us, it's not by accident. It's not, and so we can't just say, oh, just turn it off, in the same way we wouldn't someone who's addicted to something else. So I think a lot of the work that we have to do is organize to push back against the private sort of, entities that are, profiting off of our our attention, and then think about, again, uproot, but seed. What do we want instead? What does public interest technology look like? I just got actually an email from a person who's organizing, I can't remember the name of the organization, but it's something like Moms Against Addictive Technologies, something like that. She's just kind of in the early days of starting. And so this is an example of kind of deciding, like, I can't just police my kid. I need to mobilize with other people in my situation and create this, this larger sort of effort. And so that's the kind of thing, to do. If you want to do something on your own, that's fine, but at the same time, think bigger in terms of what we can do together.
Yeah, I think one of the things I really loved about the book is that you offer so much, like, this is what we can do, as opposed to, as you said, we can't just name what we don't like. We can't just name the kind of deficits. We have to actually imagine and suggest and point towards. And your book really does all of those things in every chapter, which I thought was so refreshing, actually.
Thank you.
Because not many kind of academic books, let's say, do that.
Thank you.
The balance, I think about this a lot, the balance between kind of future orientation, futurism, in the way of, the Octavia Butler, like our futures in the stars version of futurism, which I think obviously she's so important to this book. The balance between that and the kind of present of kind of what is needed in the present feels impossible sometimes, but also really critical. And I'm curious about how it is this thing of like seed as you project or seed as you imagine.
Earth seed. Yay.
Earth seed, literally, earth seed, yes. But something that Butler said that you quote in the book is, I write to create myself. And I'm curious about what, for you, there's a couple of questions that animate the book, and one of them, I think, is what can art do? I also recently read this on Instagram quote from Kurt Vonnegut talking about encouraging people to make art to experience becoming, not to get accolades, not to show it to anyone, just to learn about what's inside yourself, to make your soul grow, which I thought was very aligned with this, I write to create myself. So for you, Ruha, what is the role of art in imagination? What can art in a writ large do?
So much. And I think for me, a starting point is to think about art in its most expansive, not only the arts as we know it, but thinking about creation, self-fashioning, imagination in the mundane things as much as the things that are, that can create something that we can hold. And so when we think specifically, again, my own sort of sandbox is education. Thinking about, the way that we have organized our education system, as I hinted there in the beginning, and that there are other models that prioritize the arts, play specifically, again, thinking about play as serious business. And so looking to other countries, but other contexts in the US where children are finding ways to play by all means necessary, even when the schools are trying to stifle it out of them, And so really thinking about play not just in childhood, but in adulthood. So one of the individuals that I engage with in the book, Ariana Brazier, is a Cop City organizer. She's the one who sent me that photo of the drawing, but also she's a scholar of play. And she's really theorized the different forms of play deprivation that are structured throughout society, that especially she's focusing on Black children. And again, one of the things she does, like when she comes to visit my classes, is she makes us all sign a play pledge that we will incorporate some kind of play in our different activities, right? That seem very serious, whatever. It's like, no, find a way to like infuse it. And so I think about art, I think about play as practice, again, not as things that have to create a product or an endpoint, but as things that we practice, habits that we can form to infuse it in our everyday lives. I think that's culture, and you become a cultural worker when you start to shift norms and start to create different vibrations or relationships in the things that seem very staid and very traditional. So again, I think my engagement, my thinking about art is expansive thinking of us all as fashioners, as we can find ways in our own context. We don't have to necessarily go take a new class on something or learn you can, it's lovely, but it's also looking at the mundane things and how imagination is involved in that, cooking a meal, let's say, and also looking at the harmful forms of imagination that are in the mundane, like in school budgets, looking at the way that different schools receive different levels of resources. At one point, I think it was like $23 billion more for schools that are white and wealthy compared to their counterparts. That's a eugenics imagination at work in the Excel sheets, in the fine print of how budgets being, this thing we don't think of as a site of imagination.
As a tool of eugenics.
As a tool of eugenics or of a site of imagination, but there's a eugenics imagination being encoded into this thing that we often, aren't privy to.
Yeah, the idea of a eugenics imagination, like I had to kind of sit with that for a minute as a phrase, but also all the implications, because of course, as you lay out in the book, it has so many implications and the tentacles kind of reach deep. So in terms of this idea, you talk about kind of playfulness, making play kind of abundant in your life as a way to kind of do this. And I'm curious in terms of, in your professional life as a professor, how do you incorporate play into your classes for your students?
Yeah, so many different ways. And I don't just rely on myself. I bring in lots of cool guests too. So even just this semester, we're in week 6. And in this sort of lecture class of 60, we have done we've danced, we have done all kind of games, and it's a very serious class about world building, but like infusing these moments and connecting it. Again, the idea is we can create a world within this broader world. Like this classroom is a world. And so how can we use play for that? And then beyond this particular semester in class, I almost invariably include some kind of role playing in like class discussions where you don't just represent your own views, you come in as someone, a character that we've read, someone we've read, or someone who has a particular perspective on the material, and you speak from that perspective. So it's like getting inside the embodied, ways of understanding things. And so role playing is a huge part of most of my pedagogy. And speculation, like speculative exercises where rather than writing a boring sort of academic paper, which has its place, thesis, 5 paragraphs, et cetera, is oftentimes some kind of creative prompt where something as simple as imagine that you're the president of a new Princeton school for the imagination. Tell us what your vision is. Incorporate class material, like, something simple like that. Or the midterm for this class this semester is a podcast where they're the podcast, they're going to turn a transcript of a podcast where they're the host, and 2 of the guests are people that we've read. One is a community organizer that they identify that's, grappling with a problem that they've identified in their hometown. So finding ways to shake up the academic voice so I can actually hear them, and finding ways to prompt that and elicit that is usually what I'm going for. One, because it's so much better to read, like when you have 20 papers in front of you. And so I often am doing this out of pure selfish, like, how do I want to spend my spring break? Reading podcast transcripts or like, some other
25 papers.
Yes, exactly.
How do your students respond?
So in almost always there's a nervousness and insecurity and worry of, doing it right.
Yes.
You know, I mean, one way to think about it is if you've made it to Princeton, you have been able to jump through all of the hoops as they have been constructed for you, but you don't necessarily know how to hula hoop, right? So you jump through hoops, but you can't hula hoop. And so the idea is like, you know, you've figured out how to navigate the world as it is, so it's very hard then to shift gear and say, let's imagine the world as it could be. And then there's nervousness and there's like, what am I getting graded on here? Come on, where's the girl? So I have to give them very specific rubrics, like for their own comfort, like
For their own
anxiety.
Yeah.
But they, you know, they knock it out. They knock it out. They do it like they give it. It's a muscle. Like let's just practice. Let's just practice and get stronger over time. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the thing of it being a muscle is really clear. I was surprised to learn that play is a human right in the United Nations, you know, rights of the child.
Play is a human right.
Which the U.S. is not a signatory to.
Of course not.
So, you know, not in the United States, play is not a human right for children. But just the idea of it being codified in that way, I thought was super powerful that they had thought and, you know, realized that it actually, you know, childhood, you know, play is the work of childhood or whatever people's, you know, Montessori sayings. But the other thing that I think your book is really talking about is who gets to be human.
Yes.
And the kind of tension between that. I was, because here in New York City, for some children, play is a human right.
Yeah.
For some schools, at some schools, it is built in to the curriculum, to the pedagogy, to the way the children are taught. And not just as 5-year-olds or 4-year-olds, but, you know, moving on. But obviously, here in New York City, that is also the complete opposite is true.
Yes.
So I'm curious just if you could talk a little bit about this, you know, the kind of Sylvia Wynter, like no humans involved.
Absolutely. And just, I guess, starting first with this idea that, you know, some places, some schools, some countries like Finland recognize it, take it seriously. So kids don't really start focusing on reading and maths and so on until they're much older because they take play so seriously. Like the educators are watching the children play and figure out all the things you can learn from play. And they can learn about themselves and each other and so on. And then when these international organizations do these tests to figure out like which countries they're doing best, the Finnish students always out-test everyone else, even though they've been focusing on play. So it tells us something, right? But to your point about, you know, thinking about humanity and the human, one of the questions or the issues that came up in Race After Technology when I was starting to engage the literature and the ideology around post-humanism is simply that we all haven't had a chance to be human yet, right? So you're trying to get us post, but some of us are still trying to be human. We're petitioning to be included into this category. And so there's a particular rant in this book. It was later in the book, and then I was like, they might not read to the end. Let me put this in the front. So at the very end, do you remember that, Amy? I was like, oh, they're not going to read. So I
That's
said,
not
okay.
true. You're going to read the whole book.
I was like, cut, paste, put it in the front. So there's this whole rant around, again, thinking about the kind of quasi-religious ideology animating the tech industry, but even more broadly, a whole cluster of phrases and concepts that circulate together: post-humanism, long-termism, effective altruism. But thinking about future and present, really, it's a idea that is trying to draw our attention to the long-term future, like billions of years into the future, where we're no longer in these meat suits, where we upload our consciousness into the network, and there are billions of humans. So the idea is that we have to do everything we can now to ensure the well-being of those digital people in the future, and not get so bogged down in these pesky issues of, you know, racism, climate catastrophe, pandemics, mass hunger. You know, it's the idea that these things that most of us might regard as pretty weighty things we should be grappling with, these are, you know, short-term issues, right? This is ineffective altruism to deal with these issues. And so I'm wrestling with that in this particular rant, specifically around thinking about, okay, so there are these old stories that we've been told that we inherit and pass down, you know, whether it's, you know, patriarchy, white supremacy, class oppression, ableism, et cetera. Then there are these new stories that we haven't yet been able to carve out, whether we think about it as like our solidarity, interdependence of humanity. But then in the middle, there are these new-ish stories that seem like they're new, taking us to some, future that we want, but really are repackaging this eugenic ideology. Because when you actually listen to many of the proponents of this cluster of ideas, they're really also, in addition to painting this picture of this digital humans in the future, they're also valuing the lives of human beings in the here and now differently by saying things like, to get to that future, we really need to ensure the longevity, the well-being of those who are innovators, those who are in the West, the smart ones. Like this is who really matters, that's going to get us there. So that's why all of these other weighty issues that are affecting the masses, those aren't such a big deal because those people can die. It's a very eugenic-laden way of understanding human life. So again, I want us to be able to have our critical antenna finely honed so we can pick up on that, hear beneath the surface the good sounding rhetoric, and really pick up on the way that different human lives are being valued in this logic and calculus of what's going to get us forward. And in the process, thinking about not just the timepiece, but also the way the hierarchies are being reproduced through these notions.
One of the things that you said in that, I would not call it a rant, in that section that really has stuck with me, I think you were quoting another author about that we are in between stories right now. Yeah. And that is something that has, as just as a metaphor, but also as almost a literal kind of positioning of our current moment, which feels wildly out of control in so many ways. That we're kind of in this transitional in-between stories, and we have the opportunity to realize something different.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I got all these lovely questions from the audience, so I'm going to segue, but thank you so much,
You're going to
Ruha.
curate?
I'm gonna, yes, we're not going to ask all of them. I'm sorry, we are not going to ask all of them. So I'm going to pick, because that is my prerogative. Yes. The first one, here we go. What is it about American education that extinguishes the imagination and potential of so many students?
Oh, so many things. I mean, I had an amazing educator and farmer come to my class a few weeks ago, Bonetta Adib. And, she was talking to my students, and she was talking about reflecting on her own experience as a teacher. And she was like, she couldn't teach. Like, she had to manage the students. And then so she would create after-school programs and summer programs where she could really, engage them the way she want. But everything about the institutional structure was like managing order, discipline, and again, not all students experience this, but certainly, the vast majority. And so, again, thinking about the carceral logics that are not just in policing and prisons, but infect all of our institutions, we definitely see it at play in our schools. And so there's, just thinking about schooling as a form of, management of order, rather than really a place that's inciting the potential of young people. It's the roots of that I think we have to think about this shell and what else we can put in it, if this is not serving us, if we don't think this is real education. And the students don't. Like, I remember a few years ago, a school in Brooklyn, the school had adopted this Facebook learning summit learning platform for students to basically use tablets and do tailored learning, and used all the buzzwords. The school adopted it. And the students revolted. They walked out. They protested. They were getting 15 minutes a week with their teacher. And they said, hell no. And they walked out. And so, and an entire town in Kansas, same thing happened. Kids with disabilities were having seizures, headaches, sitting in front of these screens, like no real interaction. And so people were rejecting it. Again, in that case, the council adopted the same summit learning and without consulting, and the parents, the teacher, everyone was like, no, and pushed it out. And so it's really, so many different forces at play, I think. But I think we can go also back to the roots. But now we see this new phenomenon, the new-ish things being sold in terms of ed tech, educational technologies that are, presenting themselves as solving certain kind of problems, but they're asking the wrong questions in creating these new tools. And we're seeing people reject them en masse.
This is kind of a little bit related, but so in most organizations, strategy is exclusively for the C-suite, so for the upper level leadership. So how can organizations democratize strategic work, strategic thinking?
Yeah, so that takes us to the imagination incubator, where again, there's a lot of, I just said they're asking the wrong questions in that scenario. So I'm asking a number of questions that you can riff off and use yourself in terms of, generating the kind of conversations and deliberation that has to be had. The answer to that question has to be in situ. It has to be developed in the context in which you're trying to make some kind of change. It can't be helicoptered in by an expert who doesn't know what's going on. And so what I'm offering are prompts, and you can come up with your own prompts to be able to cultivate, to incite that collective wisdom, right? And so at the same time we're being sold AI, we need more collective wisdom. We need ways to actually generate that in the context of people who are most affected by that. And so hopefully there can be some utility in that particular chapter.
Well, speaking of AI, with the current rollout and celebration of the next big corporate tech trend, Gen AI, what are your thoughts on its impact on creativity and how to or not to use it? And is Gen AI better or worse than previous innovations?
Yeah, I think it is more captivating. I've edited a volume called Captivating Technology, where captivating is not a straightforward good, because you become captured by it. So it's certainly more alluring, captivating. There's a lot more hype around it. And so it shares many of the same problems as previous iterations, but it's also creating new, its own special, unique problems. I will say, in rolling this book out in the fall, the original cover was the artist used one of these image generating tools as part of her process. And I hadn't really realized it, and I didn't realize it was so obvious based on the image. And so I shared the cover, and there was a quick, let's call it learning curve, to put it nicely, backlash. And I realized, I'm over here looking at ed tech, I'm over here looking at policing technologies, and I didn't even pay attention to what's happening with these technologies that are affecting artists and the art world. I mean, we saw it with the Hollywood strike, right?
Yeah.
But specifically the fact that the main tools that are out there are scraping the work of millions of artists in order to train these image generators and then putting them out of work. Because you can literally put in an artist's name who's relatively well known, and it can proxy their work. And so a lot of the fears that we've associated with the robots, like putting people out of work, in many ways, this is like the front lines. We're seeing this happen in real time. And so, I went back to the press, and they were really, they worked with me in a really short time frame to change the cover. This is a photograph by Creative Soul Photography, but I think, again, going back to this idea that as individuals, it's very hard to imagine, like, what can we do in this context? But in the case of artists, they're organizing. They have lawsuits, and they're doing all kinds of things to push back against this encroachment and the idea of just theft that's built, that's normalized. It's normalized theft in the generation of this. And there are also groups not necessarily specifically focused on the arts, but technologies more broadly, that are developing this approach called consentful technologies. The fact that we should build consent into not just the design, but the deployment of these tools. If we look at the AI bill that Biden signed a few months ago, one of the pieces of that has to do with essentially like watermarking anything that's synthetic images or text, so that when you're interacting with something that is generated using one of these tools. And this is going to become very important as the election approaches, as we see more images and ads and so on, that it's going to be hard to tell what's what. But again, consent all down, up and down the pipeline, you know, from the design to the deployment. And I think that what artists are experiencing now, it's not going to be contained. It's something that we have to be thinking about more broadly in terms of work and education.
When I think of art, I think of self-awareness and a control over your own mind and body. How would you describe the role of art for communities whose bodies are in jeopardy every day from the harms of society, the harmful imaginations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one, art as reflecting those harms, like so that they're not invisibilized. I think of that as kind of art as a mirror, but then art as forward-looking, also thinking about what would bodily autonomy look and feel like, and giving expression for that. So art as something, again, that's speculative, that might not be reflecting something in the here and now, but is pointing us towards a possible future that we might want to go. So I see that in both modes, as like art has a role in terms of the harms, the mirroring, but also visionary art that's showing us where we want to go as well.
I think one of the things that you talked about that I was so happy that you talked about was Marking Time, Nicole Fleetwood's exhibition at PS1, which was all formerly incarcerated artists.
Marking Time by Nicole Fleetwood, NYU professor.
Beautiful catalog,
Yes,
and it was a beautiful show. But this idea of people, who are in the most kind of conscribed of circumstances.
In that case, art as self-fashioning. Like you're talking about incarcerated artists where everything around you is telling you that you're not human, that's robbing you of your dignity, of your worth. And so art becomes a place to fashion yourself, to remember yourself, you know, and so it becomes both a kind of spiritual exercise, but also political in pushing back against that dehumanization that is being, thrust upon you.
The last question I'm going to ask, what role does rest, relaxation, and rejuvenation have in the pursuit of honing the powers of our imagination?
Yes. I mean, for starters, it means that like daydreaming is not lazy, right? It means that, when we think about doing something productive, there's the part that you're actually doing it, but there's all of the downtime that you need in order to birth ideas and the conception. And that requires rest and what outwardly might look like, you're not doing anything. So part of it is to remember that the world is not just the worlds out here, but it's also our inner worlds. And even if people can't access it or see it, to really like own that, like having a certain level of sovereignty over your inner world, to give yourself permission, not waiting for it, to say, no, I might not look like I'm doing anything, but there's stuff going on in here, right? And so thinking about that as part of the process, and then finding ways to sort of protect that, both individually and collectively. And I write a little bit about rest, engaging the work of Tricia Hershey in Viral Justice, when we're talking about improving labor conditions, and going back to all of the ways that these tools are, diminishing that. As much as we want to advocate for more dignified and fairly compensated work, we also want to fight for the right to rest. In the same way that there's a right to play, it's not something that you have to earn, not something you have to sort of like, save up for. It's something that should be a given, that we need this, and just honor it. And so even if we're not having the policy kind of license to do that, I think we can give each other license. We can give each other room to do that in many ways, in our own workplaces, in our own classrooms, is to really find ways to honor downtime and push back against the capitalist logic of always being grinding and producing. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ruha.
Pleasure.
Such a pleasure.
Can you join me in thanking my wonderful interlocutor, Rujeko? Awesome.
There is going to be a book signing, and I was told that the line is going to be over there. If you work at New York Public Library and I'm wrong, tell me what to say. But yes, Ruha is staying to sign books, and you should buy a book.
Thanks, everyone.